All right, so yesterday, Joe Biden illegally and unconstitutionally bombed what he calls Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria. And so this isn't even the first time that he's done something like this in his early parts of his administration, but nonetheless, it's completely nonsensical and doesn't make any sense from even the bullshit justifications that they give. So I'm going to read here from a CNN article because, as we all know, CNN pretty good at being the stenographers for the Pentagon. So in other words, let's take a look at what the Pentagon line is. So President Joe Biden directed military forces to conduct defensive, keyword defensive precision airstrikes against facilities used by Iran-backed militia groups in the Iraq-Syria border region on Sunday evening, according to a news release from the Department of Defense. Quote, the targets were selected because these facilities are utilized by Iran-backed militias that are engaged in unmanned aerial vehicle UAV attacks against U.S. personnel and facilities in Iraq. Specifically, the U.S. strikes targeted operational and weapons storage facilities at 2 locations in Syria and 1 in Iraq, both of which lie close to the border between those 2 countries, the Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby said in the release, and quote, as demonstrated by this evening's strikes, President Biden has been clear that he will act to protect U.S. personnel given the ongoing series of attacks by Iran-backed groups targeting U.S. interests in Iraq. The president directed further military action to disrupt and deter such attacks. So all of this language is really important because all of this language is extremely misleading and gives you the false impression of what's actually going on here. So let's just break it down. First of all, defensive. Okay, so with a little help from Rob here, our friend Rob, the U.S. is not at war with Iran, Iraq, or Syria, and yet it apparently has the perpetual unilateral right to bomb, quote, Iran-backed militias in these illegally occupied regions and calls it self-defense. So, as he points out there, we illegally occupied and invaded Iraq and Syria. We're not welcome in these fucking countries. They don't want us to be there. And so how could you possibly illegally invade and occupy countries based on lies, set up your little military bases, and then when those bases get attacked, you turn around and call that self-defense? I'm sorry, would you like these Iran-backed militias to set up military bases here in the United States? Would you let them do that and then allow them to call it self-defense when we retaliate against them? No, of course not. This is a completely ridiculous narrative they're putting forward here. Everything that we are doing in the Middle East right now is offensive by nature. It's offensive by definition because we're not fucking welcome here. They didn't ask us to come here. And by the way, another important point of this is they say, oh, they're Iran-backed militias. These Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria, you know who they're fighting? They're fighting ISIS. They're fighting radical jihadist groups, okay? That's who we are attacking their enemies. So in other words, we are basically helping the radical jihadist elements of groups like ISIS by bombing them and by bombing these types of people who are on the ground fighting them. So when Joe Biden comes out and he pretends like, oh, this is about deterring terrorism, this is about going after the worst. No, it's not. You're literally helping ISIS by doing things like this. So that's another reason why it doesn't make any sense. But on top of that, they say, oh, it's going to deter. So President directed further military action to disrupt and deter such attacks. This is not going to deter attacks. These groups that you just attacked are literally already coming out, and they're saying, we are going to be seeking revenge for this. Okay? So this is not deterring any attacks whatsoever. And as Ilhan Omar points out here, this constant cycle of violence and retribution is a failed policy and will not make any of us safer. Congress has authority over war powers and should be consulted before any escalation. So she's 100% right about this. Again, it doesn't make sense from any angle that you look at this. One, it's illegal and it's unconstitutional. We illegally, under international law, invaded and occupied these countries, basically to jack their oil. So we illegally invade and occupy these countries. Then we turn around and pretend like it's self-defense when these countries defend themselves and attack our bases and our military operations that are not welcome in these countries. And then on top of that, they turn around and say, oh, well, this is going to deter terrorist attacks, or this is going to deter attacks against our interests in the region. What specific interests in the region? Are you talking about the Syrian oil fields that you're guarding, that we have troops literally stationed guarding Syrian oil fields? Is that what you're talking about, U.S. interests in the region? Because it pretty much literally is. So our interests in the region are not anything to do with national security. It's not anything to do with preventing terrorism because, again, we're attacking the groups that are on the ground fighting some of the most radical jihadist elements that are supposed to be our biggest enemies, like ISIS. So we're undercutting the ability for these groups to fight ISIS. We're not welcome in these countries. We're illegally and unconstitutionally there. Unconstitutional because, as Ilhan Omar points out here, he doesn't have approval from Congress. When you're going to do acts of war, you have to get approval from Congress. So it's completely unconstitutional. He's using this justification through what's called Article 2. And basically, if this justification is allowed to stand as it is right now, this just gives presidents the unilateral authority without approval from Congress, without approval from the American people, to launch airstrikes like this indefinitely. He can do it whenever he wants. He can do it wherever he wants in the Middle East and just say, oh, well, something about terrorism and we're preventing and good stuff is happening. So that's literally where we're at right now. Okay, it's illegal, it's unconstitutional. You're not deterring any of the violence, and on top of that, you're fighting the people who are out there fighting ISIS. So explain to me how this could be justified in any way, shape, or form. It's not. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. It's completely unacceptable.